Hello again, everybody, and God be with you. Well, I hope everybody is keeping well, keeping safe. If you're home, I hope you're keeping occupied as well. Here's another story from Bob Hartman's Bible Baggies. This one is called The Bully's Tale. And Bob Hartman introduces this way. The story of David and Goliath is probably one of the best known in the Old Testament. It's not hard to understand why. The world is full of bullies. When I was 7 years old, my family moved house, and would you know it? There was a bully living right across the street. I was short and shy and chubby, perfect bully fodder, and I was beaten up regularly. In those days, parents had but one response to that kind of situation. Stand up for yourself, boy. Fight back. So one day, that's exactly what I did. It was hard and it was scary, but I clenched my fists and waved my arms, and the bully ran away. I was amazed. I was in shock. In fact, I was so confused that the only thing I could think of doing was to knock on the bully's back door and apologise to his mother. Did I mention that I was also excruciatingly polite? I'm not sure what I learned from that experience at the time, but I can tell you what I think now. The bigger we get, the bigger the bullies get too. So sometimes somebody, and maybe even the last person you would expect, has to stand up and do something hard and scary. Somebody like Martin Luther King, who dreamed of a day when all people would be treated equally, regardless of their race. Somebody like William Wilberforce, who spent a lifetime arguing that slavery was wrong. Somebody like Mother Teresa, who argued that all people, poor people and sick people and people who were still waiting to be born, deserved our protection and care. And who knows, maybe someday, even somebody like you. So this is the story. He hated little things. Maybe that was because he'd never really been little himself. He'd been a baby once, of course, but he was the biggest baby that people of Gath had ever seen. So it was big robes and big sandals and big toys right from the start. And don't push that little boy, dear, and careful with that pot, child, and don't squeeze the kitty so hard, Goliath, you'll hurt him. Little things, little kitties, little people. The world was full of them, and it didn't take long for them to notice that he was different and to bring it constantly to his attention. Some children returned teasing with humour, others with sullen stares. But Goliath chose fear. Even the most harmless comment about his size would result in a furious beating from the big boy. Yes, he was beaten up a few times himself by some of Gath's older lads, but he soon outgrew them all, and then no one dared challenge the boy who stood nearly 7 feet tall. There's only one thing to do with bullies, his father finally said. The army. That'll sort him out. Given his size and his strength, he might have risen high in the ranks. But his obvious hatred of the little generals and their little rules kept him marching with the infantry. In the end, there was only one thing Goliath was good for: frightening the enemy. And he was very good at that indeed. He'd strap on his armour, all 125 gleaming pounds of it. Then he'd pick up his spear, 10 feet long with a 10-pound iron point. And finally, he would stand in front of the Philistine troops, a shining monster of a man. A challenge, he would roar, and his roar rumbled across the valley to whichever army was camped on the other side. A challenge is what I offer. Send your best man to fight me. If he wins, And here Goliath always had a little chuckle. We shall be your slaves. A few men had taken up his challenge, little men, with little swords. Goliath always smiled when he remembered how he had crushed their little heads and left their little bodies broken and twisted and torn. Most men, however, never even tried. His presence alone made their little hearts beat with fear and sent them retreating to their little tents. He expected as much today. The Israelites were not just the little people, they were the littlest of them all. A few scattered tribes, a puny, ramshackle army, and if what he heard was true, they had just one little God to protect them. It hardly seemed worth the trouble. But he marched out anyway into the valley of Elah and issued his customary challenge. He anticipated a short day's work, but he had no idea how short it would turn out to be. The Israelites heard the challenge, as they had every day for the past 40 days, and to a man they trembled. But someone else heard the challenge too, someone who had never heard it before, and it made him angry. Maybe it had to do with his feelings about his people. Maybe it had to do with his feelings about his God. Or maybe he was just tired of being little. David was the youngest of 8 brothers after all, and no matter how much courage he had shown defending his father's flock of sheep, they all still thought of him as the runt. Hand me down sandals and pass me down robes, that was his lot. And while his older brothers were able to serve as soldiers, the best he could do was to bring them lunch and carry chunks of goat cheese to their commanders. If only, David dreamed, I could do something big for a change. And then he heard Goliath's challenge. So, what do you get if you beat the giant? He asked a soldier nearby. A king's ransom, the soldier answered, and the king's own daughter. Well, mused David, I'm surprised someone hasn't accepted the challenge already. And that's when he felt a hand, a big hand, on his shoulder. The hand belonged to his oldest brother, Eliab. What are you doing here? Eliab growled. Bread, cheese, David muttered. Excuses more like it, Eliab growled. Get back to the fields where you belong. But David did not go back to the fields. No, he crept along the front lines, talking to one soldier after another, always about the giant. Finally, word got back to King Saul, who asked to see the boy. The giant, meanwhile, was still waiting. Their little hearts are in their little throats, he chuckled in a nasty sort of way. Then he looked down at his shield bearer. The little man was not chuckling back. In fact, it was all he could do in the hot noonday sun to keep himself and the shield standing upright. Pathetic, Goliath muttered, and then wondered if the Israelites would ever send him a challenger. So you want to fight the giant? Grinned King Saul. David had seen that look before. He got it from his big brothers all the time. It was that, I'm not taking you seriously, you're just a little shepherd boy kind of look. So David stood as tall as he could and answered with the straightest face and the deepest voice he could manage. Yes, your majesty, I do. And what makes you think you can beat him? The king continued, more seriously now. David didn't even have to think. I have fought lions, he said, and I have fought bears, and all to save my father's sheep. And every time the Lord God has helped me win. And I'm sure he would do so with this giant. The king didn't know what to do. But the boy had courage. The boy had faith. But if he allowed him to fight the giant, the boy would also soon be dead. Still, he needed a champion, any champion. So he made the boy an offer. My armour, said the king, pointing to the other side of the tent. At least take my armour, my shield, my sword, my breastplate, whatever you like. You will need all the protection you can get. David looked at the armour. He even tried a piece or two of it on, but it was much too big and much too heavy for him. I have all the protection I need, he said to the king at last. The Lord God himself will be my breastplate. He alone will be my shield. And he bowed and turned and walked out of the tent. Goliath, meanwhile, was tapping one big foot on the ground and humming an old Philistine folk song. In another minute, we're going back to camp, he said to his shield bearer, who breathed a relieved sigh and thanked every god he could think of. But before he could finish his prayer, a cheer rang out from the Israeli camp. Someone was walking onto the battlefield. At last, Goliath drawled, like a hungry man who has just been told it's dinner time. The figure looked small at first. Goliath put it down to the distance. But the closer it got, the smaller it seemed, until the giant realized at last that his challenger was no more than a boy. Is this some kind of joke? He muttered to his shield bearer, but neither the shield bearer nor the boy was laughing. Or is it? And here the giant's words turned into a snarl. Is it some kind of Israeli insult? Do they mock me? Do they make fun of me? Well, we'll see who has the last laugh. And then he roared so the ground shook and the shield bearer as well. Do you think I am a dog? He roared, that you come at me with this little stick of a boy? Send me a real challenger, or surrender. I am the real challenger, said David, in that deep voice he had used before the king. And the God I serve is the real God. He will give me the victory today. Goliath had heard enough. He grabbed his shield and raised his spear and charged. Little people and little generals and little soldiers. Little things have plagued him all his life. And now this little boy and his little army and his pathetic little god were going to pay. He'd skewer the lad and crush his little head and show everyone what someone big and strong could do. But as he rushed towards the boy, David calmly reached into his shepherd's pouch. He placed a small stone into his sling and he swung it round his head. Then he prayed that God would make his throw both strong and true. The stone and the giant sped towards each other. At the last moment, Goliath caught a glimpse of it, a tiny speck, a minute fragment, so small it was hardly worth avoiding. But then it struck him between the eyes, and he roared, and he cried, and fell crashing to the ground. And that little thing was the last thing that the giant ever saw. So, another one of the Bible baddies bites the dust. I remember as a child I read a Ladybird book on the story of David and Goliath. I was very taken with it. I was about 5 at the time, and I said to my mum, I think this Bible ought to be in the Bible. She humoured me. And I said, I think I'm going to write to Enid Blyton. She was another of the authors. I read a lot of Enid Blyton when I was young. And so my mum helped me to write to Enid Blyton. And I got a very polite letter back from Enid Blyton telling me that actually the story was already there. We'll have another Bible baddie story next week. In the meantime, stay safe, stay occupied, keep happy. God bless you all.